I'm a 68-year-old millionaire, and when I was 14, my family left me at a Mobil station in the pouring rain to teach me a lesson about respect. They never imagined I'd spend the next 54 years learning exactly what that lesson was worth. Last month, I changed my will. My children and grandchildren are about to discover what it feels like to be left out in the cold, permanently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony isn't lost on me. For decades, they've been counting on my money like it was already theirs, planning vacations on my dime, discussing my properties like they were inheritance catalogs, making financial decisions based on what they'd inherit when I finally died. They treated me like a walking ATM with an expiration date, never once wondering if I remembered that stormy October night in 1970 when they taught me that family love comes with conditions. Well, I remember everything. Every raindrop that soaked through my thin jacket. Every car that passed without stopping. Every hour I spent shivering on that metal bench outside Brennan's Corner Gas, wondering if anyone was coming back for me. I remember the taste of fear, metallic and sharp, mixing with the rainwater that dripped from my hair into my mouth. I remember thinking, at 14 years old, that maybe I was the kind of person who gets left behind. They were wrong about that. Dead. Wrong. See, what my family didn't know, what they still don't know, is that the girl they abandoned at that gas station grew up to become the kind of woman who builds empires out of spite, the kind of woman who turns abandonment into ammunition, the kind of woman who understands that the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served in legal documents, witnessed, notarized, and completely irreversible. My name is Margaret Thorne, though most people in Millbrook Heights call me Maggie. I own half the commercial real estate in this town, including the shopping center where that old gas station used to stand. I bought it 15 years ago and had it demolished. Put up a luxury spa in its place. Every time my daughter Carolyn gets her nails done there, she's sitting on the exact spot where her grandmother left me to learn about family loyalty. The delicious part? She has no idea. For 54 years, I've played the role they expected. The dutiful daughter who came back home after college. The devoted wife who married Harold Thorne and gave him 2 beautiful children. The doting grandmother who never missed a birthday party or school play. The generous matriarch who paid for weddings, down payments, college tuitions, and every financial emergency that came their way. But here's what they never understood. Every check I wrote was a test. Every gift was a measurement. Every time they asked for money, and they asked often, I was watching to see if they'd ever ask about anything else. About my health, about my dreams, about whether I was lonely in that big house on Elmwood Drive after Harold passed, about whether I ever got over what happened that night when I was their age. They never asked. Not once. Instead, they developed a peculiar kind of selective amnesia about my childhood. Oh, they knew the basic facts. My parents, Eleanor and Frank Westfield, had raised me and my 2 brothers, Thomas and James, in a strict household where children were expected to be seen and not heard. They knew we weren't wealthy, that money was always tight, that every penny was accounted for, and every mistake had consequences. What they chose to forget, or maybe never really understood, was what those consequences looked like for a 14-year-old. Girl who dared to speak up when she shouldn't have. The night that changed everything had started like so many others. We were driving back from visiting my Aunt Judith in Riverside County, a 2-hour trip that always felt eternal with Thomas and James bickering in the back seat, and my father's jazz music playing just loud enough to give me a headache. I was wedged between my brothers, my book bag pressed against my ribs, trying to finish a history essay that was due the next morning. When we stopped for gas in the small town of Cedar Junction, I made the mistake of asking if I could use the restroom and maybe grab a soda, not demanding, not whining, just asking, politely, the way I'd been taught. My father turned around in the driver's seat, his face already wearing that expression I'd learned to fear. The one that meant I'd crossed some invisible line I hadn't even known existed. "You think money grows on trees, Margaret? You think we're made of dollar bills?" I tried to explain that I had $3 of my own, birthday money from my grandmother, but he was already shaking his head. My mother's voice was tight when she spoke. "We told you to use the bathroom before we left Judith's house. We told you to drink water at dinner. You chose not to listen." That's when my father made his decision. The decision that would ripple through decades, shaping every choice I made, every relationship I built, every dollar I earned. "Get out," he said. "Stand right here and think about what it means to be responsible for yourself. Maybe an hour in. The rain will teach you to plan ahead." I remember looking at my mother, waiting for her to intervene, to say this was too much. Instead, she adjusted her purse strap and looked straight ahead. "Your father's right, Margaret. Sometimes lessons have to be uncomfortable," Thomas smirked from the back seat. James just stared out the window, and then they drove away, leaving me standing under a flickering neon sign as the October rain began to fall. They thought they were teaching me about consequences, about respect, about the value of money and the importance of thinking ahead. What they actually taught me was that love has conditions, that family is a contract that can be voided without notice, and that the only person I could truly count on was myself. 54 years later, I'm about to return the favor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before that rainy October night changed everything, I lived in what I thought was a normal family. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. My father, Frank Westfield, worked as a shift supervisor at the Riverside manufacturing plant, coming home every evening with grease under his fingernails and the smell of machine oil clinging to his work shirts. My mother, Eleanor, kept the books for Dr. Patterson's dental practice downtown, her neat handwriting filling ledger after ledger with careful columns of numbers. Our house on Maple Street was small but tidy, with yellow shutters that my mother repainted every other spring, and a front porch where she grew tomatoes in coffee cans. The living room had a floral sofa that nobody was allowed to sit on except during holidays, and a television that got 3 channels on a good day. My brothers and I shared the upstairs, Thomas and James in one room, me in the tiny space that had probably been meant for storage. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that were always there, hidden under the veneer of respectability that my parents worked so hard to maintain. But at 14, I thought every family operated the way ours did. I thought it was normal for children to ask permission before speaking at dinner, normal for every request to be weighed against the family budget and found wanting, normal for love to feel like a privilege you had to earn fresh every single day. My father ruled our household with the quiet authority of a man who believed that children were investments that should pay dividends in obedience and gratitude. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. A raised eyebrow was enough to silence any complaint. A disappointed sigh could end any argument. When he said, "We'll see," it always meant no. When he said, "Perhaps," it meant you hadn't asked properly. Thomas, 2 years older than me, had learned to navigate this system perfectly. He was the golden child, the one who understood exactly how much space he was allowed to take up and never exceeded it. He played football in the fall, baseball in the spring, and worked summers at the plant alongside Dad. He never asked for spending money because he earned it. He never broke curfew because he never stayed out past 9. He was everything our parents wanted in a son: respectful, responsible, and completely predictable. James, 18 months younger than me, took a different approach. He made himself invisible. While Thomas excelled, James simply existed, sliding through school with C averages and spending most of his free time reading comic books in the basement. He never asked for anything, which meant he never got denied anything. Our parents seemed to forget he was there half the time, which was exactly how he liked it. And then there was me, caught between Thomas's perfection and James's invisibility, trying to figure out where I belonged in a family that seemed to have already assigned all the available roles. I was a good student. Better than good, actually. My teachers at Cedar Junction High said I had potential, that I could probably get a scholarship to the state university if I kept my grades up. Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, had even suggested I enter a statewide essay contest with a $500 prize. But when I brought the paperwork home, my mother looked at it like I'd handed her a snake. "College is expensive, Margaret," she said, setting the forms on the kitchen counter without reading them. "Even with a scholarship, there are costs. Books, dormitory fees, meal plans. We can't afford to support dreams." My father was more direct. "Education is fine for girls to a point, but don't get ideas above your station. The Henderson woman doesn't know what she's talking about. She's never had to balance a household budget." I learned not to mention my grades after that. When I made honor roll, I kept the certificate in my locker instead of bringing it home. When I scored highest in the district on the mathematics aptitude test, I told no one. Achievement felt dangerous in our house, like it was some kind of betrayal of the family's modest expectations. But I couldn't help wanting more. I saved every penny I could find, lunch money I didn't spend, coins I found in the couch cushions, the occasional dollar my grandmother slipped me when my parents weren't looking. I kept it all in a mason jar hidden behind my winter coats, dreaming of the day I'd have enough to buy something that was entirely mine. A typewriter, maybe, so I could write the stories that filled my notebook. Or a bus ticket to somewhere bigger than Cedar Junction, somewhere that had a real library and bookstores and people who talked about ideas instead of just the weather and work. The money added up slowly. By that October, I had almost $37, more cash than I'd ever held in my life. I counted it every night before bed, planning and replanning how I might spend it. Sometimes I imagined buying a graduation dress that wasn't a hand-me-down from my cousin. Sometimes I pictured myself walking into the state university's admissions office with an application fee I'd saved myself. It was naive, of course. $37 wouldn't change my life or buy my freedom. But at 14, it felt like possibility. It felt like proof that maybe, just maybe, I could want something for myself without having to justify it to anyone else. I had no idea that wanting anything at all was exactly the problem my parents intended to solve. The day of our trip to visit Aunt Judith, I'd been excited. Aunt Judith was my mother's younger sister, unmarried and working as a secretary for a law firm in Riverside County. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery, and her place always smelled like cinnamon rolls and coffee. More importantly, she talked to me like I was a person instead of just a child who needed managing. During our visit, she'd asked about school, about my plans for the future. When I mentioned the essay contest, she'd gotten genuinely excited, telling me about writers she admired and books I should read. For 3 hours, I felt like someone who mattered, someone whose thoughts and dreams were worth discussing. I should have known better than to let that feeling follow me home. The ride home from Aunt Judith started pleasant enough. Thomas was unusually quiet, tired from helping our aunt move furniture around her apartment. James had found a stack of old National Geographic magazines and was absorbed in an article about deep-sea exploration. I sat in my usual spot behind my mother, watching the familiar countryside roll past the windows as we made our way back toward Cedar Junction. I was still glowing from Aunt Judith's encouragement about the essay contest. She'd not only read the submission guidelines, but had given me a book of poetry by a woman who'd won the Pulitzer Prize. "Words have power, Margaret," she'd said, pressing the slim volume into my hands. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The book was tucked safely in my bag, along with notes I'd scribbled about essay topics during our visit. About 30 minutes into the drive, my father pulled into Brennan's Corner Gas, a lonely station that served as the only stop for miles, along the rural highway connecting Riverside County to our town. The place looked exactly like what it was, a last resort for travelers who'd pushed their luck too far between fill-ups. The building was weathered white clapboard with green trim that had faded to the color of old lettuce. A single pump stood, guard under a corrugated metal canopy that rattled whenever the wind picked up. As my father got out to pump gas, I realized I desperately needed to use the restroom. The coffee and sweet tea Aunt Judith had served during our visit had finally caught up with me. The sky was already growing dark, and I could smell rain in the air. That heavy, metallic scent that always preceded October storms in our part of the country. "Dad," I called through the open window as he replaced the gas cap. "Could I use the restroom real quick?" He glanced at the station building, then at his watch. "We'll be home in an hour and 15 minutes. You can wait." But I couldn't wait. The pressure in my bladder was becoming urgent, and I could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. If we hit traffic or had to pull over for heavy rain, it could be much longer than an hour and 15 minutes. "Please, Dad. I really need to go. And maybe I could get a Coke for the ride home," I added, thinking of the $3 in my pocket. Money. That was genuinely mine, earned from helping Mrs. Patterson organize her recipe collection the previous weekend. That's when his expression changed. The mild annoyance I'd expected shifted into something colder, more calculating. He walked around to my side of the car and opened the door. "Get out, Margaret." I thought he was just letting me out to go to the restroom. "Thank you. I'll be really quick." "No. Get out and stay out. Stand right there by that bench." He pointed to a metal bench positioned against the station's front wall, the kind of institutional seating you'd find at a bus stop, painted green but showing rust stains where the paint had chipped away. The first drops of rain began to fall as I stepped out of the car, confusion making me stupid. "Dad, I don't understand." "You understand perfectly." His voice was level, controlled, the way it got when he was most angry. "You think you can make demands. You think you can spend money like it's water. You think you can ignore what you're told and ask for what you want instead." My mother rolled down her window then, and I looked to her desperately, certain she would intervene, would tell him this was going too far. Instead, she spoke without looking at me, her eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield. "Your father's right, Margaret. You've been getting ideas lately. Ideas about what you deserve, what you're entitled to. This is what happens when children forget their place." The rain was coming down harder now, fat drops that splattered against the concrete and sent up the smell of wet asphalt. I stood there in my thin cardigan and school skirt, the poetry book getting damp in my bag, and watched my family prepare to leave me. "How long do I have to stand here?" I asked, my voice already shaking from more than just the cold. "Until you learn," my father said, getting back into the driver's seat. "Until you understand that wanting things doesn't mean you get them. Until you stop acting like the world owes you something just because you exist." Thomas finally spoke up from the back seat, but not in my defense. "Dad, what if someone calls the police?" "No one's going to call the police over a teenager standing outside a gas station," my father replied. "And if they do, we'll explain that we're teaching our daughter about responsibility, about consequences." James said nothing at all. He'd learned long ago that invisibility was the safest strategy in our family, and he wasn't about to abandon it now, even for me. The engine started, and I felt panic rising in my chest like floodwater. "Wait, please, how will I get home? When are you coming back?" My mother finally turned to look at me, and what I saw in her face wasn't cruelty exactly, but something worse. Indifference. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than her daughter. "When you've learned your lesson," she said. "When you can appreciate what you have instead of always wanting more." And then they drove away. I stood there for a full minute after their taillights disappeared, convinced they would circle back, that this was just a scare tactic, a dramatic gesture to make their point before returning to collect me. The rain soaked through my cardigan and began dripping from my hair. Cars passed on the highway, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness, but none of them slowed. The reality of my situation settled in slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. I was alone, 14 years old, with $3 in my pocket and no way to get home. The nearest telephone was inside the gas station, but I didn't know who to call. We didn't have relatives in the area except for Aunt Judith, and she lived 2 hours away without a car. The few neighbors we knew well enough to ask for help wouldn't question my parents' decision. They'd probably agree with it. I sat down on the metal bench, my wet skirt clinging to my legs, and opened my bag to check on Aunt Judith's book. The cover was damp, but not ruined. I held it against my chest and tried to remember her words about the power of language, about not letting anyone convince me otherwise. But sitting alone in the rain, abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me, those words felt like lies, like pretty stories adults told children to make them feel better about a world that didn't actually care whether they existed or not. The neon open sign buzzed and flickered above my head, casting everything in sickly pink light. I had never felt so small, so powerless, so completely at the mercy of people who saw my need for basic human dignity as a character flaw to be corrected. That was the moment. Sitting on that rusty bench as October rain soaked through my clothes, that Margaret Westfield began to die. In her place, someone harder started to grow. Someone who would never again mistake other people's love for safety. Someone who would spend the next 54 years making sure she was never that vulnerable again. I sat on that bench for 3 hours and 47 minutes. I know because the gas station had a clock mounted above the door, its red digital numbers burning into my vision every time I looked up. The rain came in waves, sometimes a gentle mist that seemed almost apologetic, other times a driving downpour that sent water cascading off the metal canopy above the pump. The station attendant, a thin man in his 20s with prematurely gray hair, noticed me after the first hour. He kept glancing through the window, his face creasing with what looked like concern. Finally, around 9:30, he came outside carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a package of saltine crackers. "You okay out here, honey?" he asked, his voice carrying a soft mountain accent. The name tag on his uniform shirt read Dale. I wanted to lie, to tell him I was fine, that someone was coming for me soon. But the kindness in his voice broke something loose in my chest, and before I could stop myself, the whole story came tumbling out. How my family had left me here as punishment. How I didn't know when they were coming back. How I only had $3 and no way to get home. Dale listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of sympathy. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the station windows. "How old are you?" he asked. 14. Jesus Christ. He ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. "Look, I can't leave the station unattended, but there's a phone behind the counter. You can call whoever you need to call." I tried my house first, letting it ring 15 times before hanging up. Either they weren't home yet, or they were deliberately not answering. I called Aunt Judith next, but her phone just rang and rang. She was probably out for the evening, maybe at the movies or visiting friends. Dale watched me make the calls, his expression growing more troubled with each failed attempt. When I hung up after trying our house a second time, he made a decision. "I'm calling the county sheriff," he said. "No, please don't," I said quickly, panic flaring in my chest. My father said this was about learning responsibility. "If you call the police, it'll just make everything worse when I get home." Dale looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Honey, I've got a daughter about your age. If her mama tried to pull something like this, I'd lose my mind. This isn't about responsibility. This is—" He trailed off, seeming to search for words that wouldn't frighten me more than I already was. But he made the call anyway, speaking in low tones while I sat back down on the bench, clutching the coffee cup for warmth. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived in a patrol car that looked older than I was. Deputy Matthews was a heavy-set woman in her 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen enough human foolishness to fill several lifetimes. She took my statement sitting in her patrol car with the heater running, writing everything down in careful block letters. My name, my address, my parents' names, the make and model of our car. She asked detailed questions about what had been said, what the argument was about, how long I'd been sitting outside. "And your parents just drove off?" she asked, looking up from her notepad. "They said I needed to learn a lesson about wanting things I couldn't have." Deputy Matthews made a note, her pen pressing hard enough against the paper that I could hear the scratching sound. "What time did they leave you here?" "Around 6:15. She glanced at the dashboard clock, which read 10:43 p.m. 4.5 hours. Another note. "And you've tried calling home?" 3 times. No answer. She closed the notepad and leaned back in her seat, studying me with eyes that had probably seen every variety of family dysfunction the county had to offer. "Well, Margaret, I can't just leave you sitting here all night, and I can't take you home without talking to your parents first." She tried calling our house from the station phone, letting it ring for a full minute before hanging up. Then she called the Cedar Junction Police Department and asked them to do a welfare check at our address. While we waited for them to call back, she bought me a sandwich from the vending machine and let me sit in the warm patrol car. The call came back 20 minutes later. Our house was dark. No cars in the driveway, no answer at the door. My family had gone somewhere else for the night. "Well," Deputy Matthews said after hanging up, "that settles it. You're coming with me." She drove me to the county children's emergency shelter in Millbrook Heights, a converted Victorian house that smelled like disinfectant and institutional cooking. The night supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was a small Asian woman with kind eyes who processed my intake paperwork with practiced efficiency. She gave me a pair of pajamas that had been donated by someone who'd clearly never been 14. They had cartoon bears on them and were 2 sizes too big. "This is just temporary," she assured me as she showed me to a small dormitory room with 4 narrow beds. "In the morning, we'll contact your parents and work this out." But lying awake in that unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of other, displaced children moving restlessly in their sleep, I had a terrible suspicion that nothing was going to be worked out. That my parents had calculated exactly how far they could push this lesson without facing real consequences, and that they'd be back tomorrow with explanations and justifications that would satisfy the authorities. I was right. They arrived at 9:30 the next morning, both dressed in their Sunday clothes and carrying the kind of subdued, responsible expressions people wear when they're performing contrition for an audience. My father spoke to Mrs. Chen and Deputy Matthews in the hallway while my mother sat beside me in the visitors' room, her hands folded in her lap. "We were worried sick," she said, her voice perfectly calibrated to convey maternal concern. "When we drove back to get you and you weren't there. We spent all night driving around looking for you. We never imagined someone would call the authorities. It was a masterful performance." She managed to suggest that they'd only meant to leave me for a short time, that their failure to return promptly was due to concern rather than calculation, and that involving the police had been an overreaction that had unnecessarily traumatized everyone involved. Deputy Matthews wasn't entirely convinced. I could see the skepticism in her eyes. But there was no law against making your teenager wait outside a gas station for a few hours. No crime in teaching lessons that went slightly awry. The report she filed would note parental discipline incident, resolved, and that would be the end of it. My father shook Deputy Matthews's hand and thanked her for her professionalism. He promised Mrs. Chen that nothing like this would happen again. He even tipped Dale $20 when we stopped back at the gas station to collect my bag, playing the role of the grateful parent whose child had been looked after by a good Samaritan. The drive home was silent, except for the radio playing softly in the background. I sat in the back seat, wearing the same damp clothes from the night before, watching the familiar countryside pass by the windows. Thomas and James were waiting when we got home, both looking relieved and slightly awed, as if I'd returned from some dangerous adventure rather than a night in protective custody. Nobody apologized. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody acknowledged that anything unusual had happened at all. At dinner that evening, my father said grace and thanked God for bringing our family safely together again. My mother served pot roast and mashed potatoes, asking Thomas about his upcoming history test and James about his science project. When she asked what I'd like to drink, her voice carried the same casual tone she'd use any other night. "Water's fine," I said, and that was that. The lesson was over, the family had moved on, and I was expected to move on too. The only sign that anything had changed was the way they all avoided meeting my eyes, as if looking directly at me might force them to acknowledge what they'd done. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. As I lay in my bed that night, still smelling the industrial soap from the children's shelter on my skin, I understood that I was now completely alone in a way I'd never been before. They could take me back, feed me dinner, and pretend everything was normal, but they couldn't take back the knowledge that they were capable of abandoning me. That their love had conditions I might unknowingly violate at any moment. That night, I started planning. The changes started small, so gradual that even I didn't notice them at first. The morning after I returned from the children's shelter, I woke up earlier than usual, not by choice, but because my body refused to sleep past dawn. Every sound in the house made me tense: footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, car doors slamming outside. Part of me was still waiting for someone to come and take me away again. I stopped asking for things entirely. When my mother served dinner, I ate whatever was put in front of me without comment, even when she gave me smaller portions than my brothers. When my father asked if I needed anything for school, I said no, even though my history textbook was falling apart, and I'd been sharing supplies with classmates for weeks. When Thomas borrowed my sweater without asking and returned it with a stain, I didn't mention it. The essay contest deadline passed while I sat in my room, staring at the blank application form. I'd written 3 different essays, each one better than the last. But every time I thought about asking my parents to drive me to the post office, I remembered sitting in that patrol car while Deputy Matthews wrote, "Parental discipline incident, resolved," in her notepad. I threw the essays away the day after the deadline, tearing them into small pieces that I flushed down the toilet so no one would find them in the trash. School became my refuge, but even there, I changed. I stopped raising my hand in class, even when I knew the answers. I ate lunch alone in the library instead of sitting with the group of girls I'd tentatively befriended earlier in the year. When Mrs. Henderson asked why I'd missed the essay contest deadline, I told her I'd decided I wasn't ready for that kind of competition. She looked disappointed, but she didn't push. The money became my obsession. The $3 I'd had in my pocket the night at the gas station felt like nothing now. A pathetic amount that couldn't buy safety or independence or even a bus ticket to somewhere else. I started hoarding every penny I could find or earn. Lunch money I didn't spend because I'd learned to go without eating during the day. Change I found in the couch cushions when my mother made me clean the living room. The occasional dollar from helping neighbors with small tasks. I got creative about earning money without my parents knowing. Mrs. Patterson at the dental office sometimes hired me to file papers or organize supplies after school, paying me in cash that she slipped into my hand with a wink. I told my parents I was staying late for study groups. Mr. Kowalski down the street paid me to walk his elderly dog twice a week, another secret transaction that added to my growing emergency fund. The mason jar behind my winter coats grew heavier each week. By Christmas, I had $63. By spring, it was over $100. I counted it every night before bed, planning escape routes that became more detailed and realistic as the amount increased. A bus ticket to Riverside County cost $8. A week at the YMCA was $15. If I could save $200, maybe I could disappear entirely. But money wasn't the only thing I collected. I started gathering information with the methodical patience of someone who understood that knowledge was another form of power. I memorized bus schedules and train timetables. I learned which businesses in town hired teenagers without asking too many questions. I found out which of my teachers lived alone and might rent a room to a responsible student. I researched emancipation, laws at the public library, reading legal texts with the focused intensity of someone whose life might depend on understanding the fine print. Most importantly, I learned to watch my family with new eyes. I studied their patterns, their moods, their triggers. I noticed that my father was more likely to explode over small things when he'd had a difficult day at the plant. I saw how my mother's mouth tightened whenever money was mentioned, how she counted and recounted the bills in her purse before going grocery shopping. I observed that Thomas's golden child status depended on his continued perfection, and that James's invisibility strategy only worked as long as he never needed anything. I became fluent in the language of walking on eggshells. I learned to read the atmosphere of a room within seconds of entering it. I developed an almost supernatural ability to predict which of my words or actions might trigger another lesson, and I adjusted my behavior accordingly. I became the most agreeable, undemanding, forgettable daughter imaginable. The irony wasn't lost on me, even at 14. By trying to teach me not to want anything, they'd created someone who wanted everything, but who had learned to hide those wants behind a mask of perfect compliance. By abandoning me to teach me independence, they'd forced me to become truly independent in ways they never intended. My grades, surprisingly, improved. When you have nothing else to focus on except survival and escape planning, academic achievement becomes almost mechanical. I completed assignments with robotic precision, participated in class discussions with careful neutrality, and tested at levels that impressed my teachers without drawing attention from my parents. I was aiming for valedictorian not out of pride, but because I'd learned that scholarships were the difference between eventual freedom and permanent captivity. The other students began to see me differently too, though I'm not sure they could have articulated what had changed. I'd become quieter, more self-contained, somehow older than my years. I no longer tried to fit in with any particular group because I'd stopped believing that belonging was possible. Instead, I cultivated useful relationships, study partnerships with the smartest kids, friendly acquaintance with the teachers who might write recommendations, cordial distance from everyone else. By the end of my freshman year, I had transformed into someone my former self wouldn't have recognized. I spoke when spoken to, never asked for anything I didn't absolutely need, and spent my free time either working, studying, or planning for a future that existed entirely outside my current circumstances. The girl who had sat on that gas station bench reading poetry and dreaming about college essay contests was gone. In her place was someone harder, more calculating, more focused. Someone who understood that survival required strategy, that security could only be built through careful accumulation of resources and options. Someone who would never again be vulnerable enough to sit in the rain waiting for people who might not come back. My parents thought they'd won. They saw my compliance, my good grades, my lack of demands, and congratulated themselves on having successfully corrected my attitude. They had no idea they'd created their own destruction. They couldn't see that every quiet yes ma'am and no sir was another deposit in an account I was building, not just of money, but of resentment, determination, and iron-willed patience. They thought they'd taught me my place. What they'd actually taught me was that I would never stay in any place I didn't choose for myself. 4 years later, I graduated valedictorian of Cedar Junction High with a full academic scholarship to Millbrook State University and $1,700 hidden in various places around my childhood bedroom. My parents attended the graduation ceremony wearing their Sunday best, beaming with pride as I delivered a speech about overcoming challenges and pursuing dreams. They shook hands with my teachers, accepted congratulations from other parents, and posed for photos that would sit in frames on our mantelpiece for exactly 2 weeks before being quietly moved to a drawer. The scholarship covered tuition, room, board, and books. I wouldn't need a cent from them, which was exactly how I'd planned it. The day after graduation, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, loaded them into the school counselor's car. Mrs. Rodriguez had offered to drive me to campus since my parents claimed they couldn't take time off work, and left Cedar Junction without looking back. At Millbrook State, I studied business administration with a minor in real estate law. While other students struggled with homesickness or partied their way through freshman year, I worked. I had a job in the university library, another at a local coffee shop, and I tutored struggling students in mathematics and economics. My classmates thought I was antisocial or overly serious. They had no idea I was building a foundation for something much larger than a college degree. I graduated summa cum laude in 3.5 years, having earned enough credits through summer classes and testing out of prerequisites to finish early. More importantly, I graduated with 0 debt, $8,000 in savings, and a job offer from Pemberton & Associates, a commercial real estate firm in Millbrook Heights that specialized in acquiring distressed properties for redevelopment. My starting salary was modest, barely enough to rent a studio apartment in a decent neighborhood, but I lived like a monk anyway. I bought clothes at thrift stores, cooked every meal at home, and walked to work instead of buying a car. Every penny that didn't go toward absolute necessities went into my savings account. By my second year at Pemberton, I'd saved enough to make my first real estate investment, a rundown duplex in a neighborhood that was just beginning to show signs of gentrification. I fixed it up myself, learning plumbing and electrical work from library books and YouTube videos. I rented out both units and used the rental income to buy another property, then another. By the time I was 25, I owned 6 rental properties and had started my own small development company. By 30, I owned 43 properties and had my eye on commercial developments. The secret to my success wasn't just hard work, though I worked harder than anyone I knew. It was the lesson my parents had taught me that night at the gas station, that security is an illusion unless you build it yourself. Every property I bought, every tenant I screened, every renovation I completed was another layer of protection between me and the kind of helplessness I'd felt sitting on that metal bench in the rain. I never forgot where I came from, but I rarely went back. My contact with my family dwindled to Christmas cards and brief phone calls on birthdays. When my parents called to brag about Thomas's promotion at the manufacturing plant, or James's marriage to his high school girlfriend, I listened politely and offered appropriate congratulations. When they mentioned that money was tight or that they were worried about retirement, I made sympathetic sounds but offered no solutions. They never asked about my business directly, but I could hear the curiosity in their voices. Word had gotten back to Cedar Junction that Eleanor and Frank Westfield's daughter was doing well for herself in the big city. They'd heard she owned property, that she drove a nice car, that she'd been featured in the local business journal as one of 30, under 30 to watch. But they never asked how much I was worth, and I never volunteered the information. The truth was, by the time I turned 35, I was worth more than my father had earned in his entire career at the manufacturing plant. By 40, I owned more real estate than anyone else in Millbrook Heights under the age of 60. By 50, I was a millionaire several times over, with a portfolio that included shopping centers, office buildings, and the kind of generational wealth that transforms families. But the family I'd been born into would never benefit from that transformation. When I was 38, I met Harold Thorne at a Chamber of Commerce mixer. He was a widower with 2 teenage children, Carolyn and Michael, and a small but successful insurance agency. He was kind in a way that still surprised me, patient with my workaholic tendencies, and completely unintimidated by my success. When he proposed 2 years later, I said yes, not because I needed rescuing, but because I'd finally built enough security to risk loving someone again. Harold adopted my business mindset with the same methodical approach he brought to insurance underwriting. Together, we expanded both our companies, leveraging our combined assets to make larger acquisitions and more ambitious developments. When he died of a heart attack at 63, I inherited not just his business but also the parental relationship with Carolyn and Michael that I'd never expected to have. They were good kids, adults by then, really, but they'd grown up with the kind of stable, loving family that produced people who trusted that safety was permanent. They asked for help with down payments and business loans and college funds for their own children, and I gave it freely, watching with fascination as they navigated a world where family support was assumed rather than earned. Meanwhile, my birth. Family aged into the kind of struggles that come with blue-collar retirement and insufficient savings. Thomas's pension from the plant was smaller than expected. James's wife had medical bills that insurance didn't cover. My parents' house needed repairs they couldn't afford, and their Social Security checks barely covered their prescription medications. Knew all of this not because they told me directly, but because I'd maintained relationships with a few people from Cedar Junction who kept me informed about local gossip. Mrs. Patterson, now retired from Dr. Patterson's practice, sent me Christmas cards with long, newsy letters about who was doing well and who was struggling. Dale from the gas station, now the owner of his own automotive repair shop, occasionally called to update me on the changes in town. Through these sources, I learned that my parents had started mentioning me more frequently in conversations with neighbors, not with pride in my accomplishments, but with expectation of what those accomplishments might eventually mean for them. They'd begun telling people that their daughter had done well for herself, that she was successful in real estate, that families should stick together when times got tough. They were laying the groundwork for a conversation they assumed would eventually happen. A conversation where I would step in to solve their financial problems, buy them a better house, pay for their medical expenses, and generally provide the security they'd never bothered to build for themselves. They had no idea that I'd been waiting 54 years for them to need something from me. No idea that the girl they'd left in the rain had grown up to become someone who never forgot a debt, and certainly no idea that I'd been planning exactly how to repay them for the lesson they'd taught me about what family really means. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 54 years and 3 days after they'd left me at Brennan's Corner Gas. I was in my home office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant buzzed to tell me that someone named Eleanor Westfield was on line 2, claiming to be my mother. I stared at the blinking light for a full 30 seconds before picking up the receiver. Margaret? Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, tremulous in a way that immediately told me this wasn't a social call. Margaret, honey? Is that really you? I hadn't been called honey by anyone in my birth family since I was 14 years old. The endearment felt calculated, desperately applied like makeup over a bruise. Hello, Mother. I kept my voice neutral, professional. It's been a while. Yes, it has, hasn't it? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I know we haven't been the best at staying in touch. Your father and I, we've always respected that you built your own life, that you didn't need us interfering. Already she was rewriting history, transforming decades of mutual indifference into some kind of noble parental restraint. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch until she felt compelled to fill it. The thing is, Margaret, we're having some difficulties. Your father's health isn't what it used to be, and the medical bills, well, they're substantial. The insurance doesn't cover everything, and our savings. She trailed off, perhaps hoping I would jump in with an offer of assistance. I'm sorry to hear that, I said. What exactly is wrong with him? His heart. He had a massive attack 6 months ago. His second one, actually. The first was smaller, 2 years ago. But we managed that one at home mostly. This one was different. He was in intensive care for 3 weeks, and now he needs constant monitoring, medications, regular appointments with specialists. The cardiologist wants him to have surgery, but it's experimental, not covered by Medicare. I made appropriate sounds of concern while mentally calculating what this was costing them. Heart surgery could easily run into 6 figures. Ongoing cardiac care, medications, home health aides, it would drain whatever savings they had within months. How much does the surgery cost? I asked. $85,000, plus the recovery time, the follow-up care. We're looking at over $100,000, maybe more. Her voice cracked slightly. Margaret, I know we haven't been close. I know we made mistakes when you were younger. But you're our daughter. You're the only one who might be able to help us. There it was. The admission that Thomas, the golden child, and James, the invisible son, couldn't save them. That despite their lifetime of investment in my brothers, I was the one they'd turned to in their hour of need. What about Thomas and James? I asked. Surely they can contribute something. Thomas is stretched thin already. The plant cut his hours last year, and with Jennifer's student loans and the kids' activities, he's barely making ends meet. And James, well, you know James never was much for planning ahead. He and Linda are living paycheck to paycheck, have been for years. So the sons who'd been raised to believe they mattered, who'd been given every advantage and encouragement my parents could provide, had grown into men who couldn't help their own parents in a crisis, while the daughter who'd been abandoned and forgotten had become the family's only hope for salvation. I see, I said. And what made you think to call me now, after all these years? Well, we've heard things. Around town, people talk. They say, you've done very well for yourself, that you own properties, that you're successful. We're so proud of you, Margaret. We always knew you had potential. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd always known I had potential. They were proud of me, as if they hadn't spent my entire childhood crushing every ambition I'd expressed, as if they hadn't left me in the rain to cure me of wanting anything beyond their narrow expectations. Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might be able to help, my mother continued. She said you were featured in some business magazine, that you're quite well off now. Not that we expect anything, of course, but if you could see your way to maybe helping with some of the medical bills. Mrs. Patterson. Of course. The woman who'd given me my first paying job, who'd slipped me cash when I was 14 and desperate. She was in her 80s now, and probably saw my parents' situation as an opportunity for family reconciliation. She had no idea what she'd set in motion. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. This is a lot to process. Can I call you back? Of course, of course. Take all the time you need. We're just so grateful that you're willing to consider it. Your father will be so relieved to know I talked to you. How is his mental state? I asked. The stress of the illness, the financial pressure, is he handling it well? Oh, you know your father. He's trying to stay strong, but I can see it's wearing on him. He keeps saying he doesn't want to be a burden, that he never expected to need help at this stage of his life. It's breaking my heart to watch him worry. Frank Westfield, who'd taught his 14-year-old daughter about self-reliance by abandoning her at a gas station, was now worried about being a burden. The irony was so perfect, it made my chest tight with something that might have been laughter if it weren't so cold. I understand, I said. Let me review my finances and see what might be possible. I'll call you back by the end of the week. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you so much. I can't tell you what this means to us, just knowing you're willing to consider it. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the October rain streak down the windows. It was almost exactly the same weather as that night 54 years ago. The same gray sky, the same steady drumming of water against glass, the same chill in the air that made you want to find somewhere warm and safe. But I wasn't 14 anymore. I wasn't sitting on a metal bench with $3 in my pocket, wondering if anyone would come back for me. I was sitting in a leather chair in an office overlooking properties worth millions of dollars, and the people who'd left me in that rain were now asking me to rescue them from their own storm. The girl they'd abandoned would have said yes immediately, grateful for any chance to earn their love and approval. The woman I'd become was going to make them wait, just like they'd made me wait. I spent the next 3 days doing what I'd learned to do best, gathering information and planning strategy. Before I made any decisions about my parents' request, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I started by calling my private investigator, Marcus Chen, the same firm I used for tenant background checks and business due diligence. "I need a comprehensive financial report on Frank and Eleanor Westfield," I told him, providing their address and social security numbers. Everything. Assets, debts, income sources, medical expenses, spending patterns for the last 5 years. And I want it done discreetly. Marcus had worked for me long enough to know I didn't make requests like this casually. "How deep do you want me to go?" "Deep enough to know if they're telling me the truth about their situation. And deep enough to know what they're not telling me." While Marcus worked his magic with financial databases and public records, I made my own calls. Dr. Harrison at Millbrook General had been my physician for 15 years, and his father had been the cardiologist at Cedar Junction Hospital for decades before retiring. One phone call connected me to someone who could access my father's medical records, legally, of course, since I was listed as his next of kin on his emergency contact forms. The medical situation was exactly as my mother had described, but with additional details that painted an even grimmer picture. Frank Westfield had suffered his first heart attack 3 years ago, not 2. He'd ignored the warning signs for months before seeking treatment, and he'd been non-compliant with his medication, regimen, and dietary restrictions. The second attack had been massive, requiring emergency surgery and leaving him with significant damage to his cardiac muscle. Without the experimental surgery, his prognosis was 18 months to 2 years. With the surgery, he might live 5 to 7 years, assuming he followed all post-operative protocols. The total cost, including surgery, recovery, and ongoing care, would likely exceed $150,000 over the next 2 years. But the most interesting information came from Marcus's financial investigation. The report arrived on Friday morning. 53 pages of documentation that revealed decades of poor financial decisions masked by working-class pride. My parents weren't just struggling with medical bills. They'd been living beyond their means for years. Frank had taken early retirement at 62, accepting a reduced pension because he'd wanted to enjoy life while he was still healthy. They'd refinanced their house twice, pulling out equity to pay for Thomas's wedding, James's various business ventures that had failed, and a series of vacations and purchases that had seemed reasonable at the time. Their current debt load was staggering. Credit cards maxed out at $43,000, a home equity loan with $18,000 remaining, car payments on a truck Frank had bought new 3 years ago instead of keeping the perfectly functional vehicle he'd owned outright. Even without the medical bills, they were barely meeting minimum payments on monthly obligations that exceeded their Social Security income by nearly $800. Most telling of all were the patterns of financial help they'd received and given over the years. Thomas had borrowed money from them repeatedly, for his down payment, for his children's school expenses, for various emergencies that seemed to occur with suspicious regularity. According to the bank records Marcus had accessed, my parents had given Thomas over $60,000 in the past decade, most of it never repaid. James's financial relationship with them was even more concerning. He'd borrowed money for a failed restaurant venture, a get-rich-quick scheme involving cryptocurrency, and most recently, to avoid foreclosure on his house. The total was approaching $40,000, and like Thomas's debts, none of it had been repaid. Meanwhile, I appeared nowhere in their financial records. No loans, no gifts, no emergency assistance. In 54 years, they had never once offered me financial help, and I had never asked for it. The daughter they'd raised to expect nothing had required nothing. The sons they'd indulged had consumed their parents' financial security. But the investigation revealed something else, something that made my chest tighten with a familiar mixture of anger and vindication. my parents had been talking about me to their financial advisor at the local bank. According to notes in their file, they'd mentioned having a successful daughter in real estate who might be able to help with their financial difficulties if the situation became desperate. They'd been planning this conversation for months, maybe years. The phone call hadn't been a last resort born of sudden crisis. It had been a calculated decision to finally cash in on the investment they'd never made. I also learned about the conversations they'd been having around town. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only source of information about my success. They'd been asking questions, gathering details about my business holdings and net worth. According to Marcus's sources, Frank had been seen at the public library using the computer to research property values and business licenses associated with my name. They knew exactly how much I was worth. They knew I could easily afford to pay for his medical care without significant impact to my lifestyle. They'd done their homework before making their plea for help. Armed with this information, I made my final preparations. I called my attorney, Rebecca Morrison, and scheduled a meeting to discuss the legal implications of various forms of financial assistance. I wanted to understand exactly what I would and wouldn't be obligated to provide if I chose to help them. Are we talking about a loan or a gift? Rebecca asked during our meeting. I'm not sure yet. What I need to know is what happens if I establish a pattern of financial support. Could they claim some kind of dependency relationship? Could they have legal recourse if I stopped providing assistance? Rebecca walked me through the relevant laws, the importance of documentation, and the ways to structure any financial arrangement to protect my interests. She also provided information about elder care obligations, inheritance planning, and the legal concept of undue influence, something that worked both ways. Most importantly, she helped me understand something I'd been contemplating since my mother's phone call: the power that comes with being needed by people who had once made you feel worthless. Margaret, she said as our meeting concluded, I've known you for 10 years. You're not someone who makes impulsive decisions about money. Whatever you're planning, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. I assured her that my reasons were very clear. That evening, I sat in my study with all the information spread across my desk: financial records, medical reports, legal documents, and my own handwritten notes about the conversation with my mother. The rain was falling again, drumming against the windows with the same rhythm I remembered from that night 54 years ago. I had everything I needed to make my decision. More than that, I had everything I needed to make them understand exactly what their decision would cost them. I picked up the phone to call my mother back, but first, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I drove to the cemetery where Harold was buried and stood at his grave in the gentle rain. They want my help, I told him, as if he were still there to listen. The people who taught me that wanting help was selfish. They want me to save them. The irony would have made Harold laugh. He'd always said that life had a way of bringing things full circle, that people eventually had to face the consequences of their choices. I touched his headstone and made my decision. It was time to give my parents exactly the kind of help they deserved. I called my mother back on Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after her initial plea. I'd let her wait, let her wonder, let her imagine all the ways this conversation might go. When she answered on the second ring, her voice carried the barely controlled desperation of someone who'd been staring at the phone for days. Margaret? Oh, thank goodness. I was starting to worry that maybe you'd decided. Hello, Mother. I said I'd call by the end of the week. It's Sunday. Of course, yes, I didn't mean to imply. We're just anxious, you understand. Your father's been asking every day if I'd heard from you. I'm sure he has. I've given your request a lot of thought, and I've done some research into your situation. Research? Her tone shifted slightly, a note of uncertainty creeping in. Yes. When someone asks me for $100,000, I make it my business to understand exactly what I'm being asked to fund. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact, as if this were any other business transaction. I know about the credit card debt. I know about the home equity loan. I know about the money you've given Thomas and James over the years. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally, she spoke, her voice smaller than before. I don't understand why that matters. Those are family obligations. When your children need help, you help them. Interesting perspective. I was under the impression that when children need help, parents teach them about responsibility, about consequences, about not expecting things they haven't earned. Margaret, that's not... This is different. This is about your father's life. And what happened to me when I was 14 wasn't about my life. Another silence. I could almost hear her mind working, trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation that wasn't going the way she'd planned. I thought we were past all. That, she said finally. You were just a child then. You didn't understand what we were trying to teach you. You're right. I didn't understand. But I learned anyway. I paused, letting that sink in. I learned that love has conditions. I learned that family support has to be earned. I learned that when people say they're teaching you a lesson, what they really mean is they're showing you exactly how much you matter to them. Margaret, please. Whatever mistakes we made when you were young, this isn't the time to... Actually, Mother, this is exactly the time. Because you taught me something else that night at the gas station. You taught me what it feels like to sit in the rain, waiting for help that might never come. And now you know what that feels like too. I could hear her breathing change, becoming sharper, more panicked. What are you saying? I'm saying I've decided what kind of help I'm going to give you, the same kind you gave me when I was 14 and desperate. I don't understand. Let me be clearer. I'm going to leave you exactly where you are and let you figure out your own solution. I'm going to teach you about self-reliance and personal responsibility. I'm going to show you what happens when you don't plan ahead and then expect other people to rescue you from your poor decisions. Margaret, you can't be serious. Your father is dying. And I was a child, alone, in the rain, for hours, while you drove around the block teaching me a lesson about not wanting things. My voice remained steady, but I could feel the heat of 54 years of carefully controlled anger behind each word. Did you think I would forget? Did you think I would grow up grateful for that lesson? We never meant to hurt you, but you did hurt me. Permanently. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire adult life unable to trust that people who say they love you won't abandon you the moment you become inconvenient? Do you know what it's like to build every relationship on the assumption that you're dispensable? Margaret, please. I became successful in spite of you, not because of you. Every dollar I earned, every property I bought, every goal I achieved was fueled by the memory of sitting on that bench, wondering if anyone was coming back for me. You created exactly the person you deserved to have as a daughter. Someone who learned your lessons too well. I could hear her crying now, soft sobs that might have moved me once upon a time, before I learned that tears could be manipulative, before I understood that people only show regret when they need something. What about forgiveness? She whispered. What about family? What about it? You taught me that family is conditional, that love has to be earned, that when someone asks for help, the appropriate response is to make them prove they deserve it. I paused, savoring the moment I'd been building toward for 5 decades. Well, Mother, you haven't earned it. The medical bills will be your responsibility. Just like everything else should have been your responsibility instead of something you passed off to your children. Thomas and James can figure out how to help you. After all, you invested so much in them over the years. They can't, then I guess you'll have to learn to do without. Just like I did. I could hear my father's voice in the background asking what was happening, why she was crying. I waited while she tried to compose herself, tried to find some new angle of approach. Margaret, I know you're angry, but please don't let your anger at us hurt your father. He's not the same man he was when you were 14. He's sick, he's scared, and he needs He needs to learn about consequences. Isn't that what you called it? A lesson about what happens when you don't plan ahead? When you expect help without earning it? I stood up from my desk, looking out at the rain that had started falling again. You know what the beautiful thing is, Mother? I'm not even angry anymore. I'm grateful. You taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that the only person I can count on is myself. So you're really not going to help us. Oh, but I am helping you. I'm giving you exactly the same gift you gave me. The opportunity to learn self-reliance. The chance to discover what you're really made of when no one is coming to rescue you. This is cruel. No, Mother. This is education. This is character building. This is all the things you told the police it was when they found me waiting in the rain. I hung up before she could respond, before she could try another approach or make another plea. I sat back in my chair and waited for the satisfaction I'd expected to feel. The vindication, the sense of justice finally served. Instead, I felt something else entirely. The quiet peace of a debt finally paid in full. The phone calls started the next day. First from Thomas, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Then James, stammering through apologies and explanations I'd heard decades too late. My mother called again, then again, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I deleted without listening to completely. By Thursday, they'd enlisted Mrs. Patterson to call on their behalf, her elderly voice trembling as she tried to convince me that family forgiveness was more important than old wounds. I let them all talk. I let them plead and bargain and make promises they should have made 54 years ago. But I didn't change my mind, and I didn't take any of their calls. Instead, I spent the week putting my real plan into motion. The plan I'd been refining since that Sunday night phone call. The plan that would ensure my lesson to them was as permanent and comprehensive as the one they'd taught me. On Friday morning, I drove to the offices of Morrison & Associates and signed the documents Rebecca had prepared. The new will was 37 pages of precisely crafted legal language that would have taken my parents hours to read and understand if they'd ever been given the chance. It included detailed explanations for every decision, specific bequests to charities and individuals who had shown me kindness over the years, and provisions for Carolyn and Michael that would secure their futures for generations. My birth family was mentioned exactly once, in a single paragraph that left them nothing but a clear explanation of why. To my biological parents, Frank and Eleanor Westfield, and to my brothers, Thomas and James Westfield, I leave nothing. This is not an oversight. This is the natural conclusion of the lesson they taught me on October 15, 1970, when they abandoned their 14-year-old daughter at a gas station in the rain to teach her about self-reliance and personal responsibility. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. I learned to rely only on myself, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that the consequences of their choices follow them for the rest of their lives. But the will was only the beginning. Over the next month, I implemented a plan that was as methodical as everything else I'd built. I contacted every bank, financial institution, and creditor in Cedar Junction and the surrounding counties. I made it known that I would not be financially responsible for any debts incurred by Frank and Eleanor Westfield, despite any claims of family relationship they might make. I wanted no confusion about where I stood when their bills came due. More importantly, I began a careful campaign of public education in their small town. I donated $50,000 to the Cedar Junction Public Library for a new children's wing, with a plaque that read, "In memory of all children who learned to rely on themselves when no one else would." I funded a scholarship program at Cedar Junction High School specifically for students from troubled homes who planned to leave town for college. I made sure people understood who was behind these generous donations, not out of ego, but to make certain that everyone in town knew exactly how successful the abandoned daughter had become, and exactly what her parents had lost through their own choices. The most satisfying moment came when I purchased the property that had once housed Brennan's Corner Gas. It had changed hands several times over the decades, becoming a fast food restaurant, then a convenience store, then sitting empty for years as the rural highway was bypassed by a new interstate. I bought it for far more than it was worth and had it demolished within a week. In its place, I built something beautiful, a small community center with a library, meeting rooms, and a cafe. The sign outside read, "The Margaret Thorne Community Center, where everyone is welcome." Inside, mounted on the wall where that old metal bench had once sat, was a bronze plaque with a simple inscription, "Sometimes the best lessons are the ones we teach ourselves." The local newspaper covered the grand opening, featuring a full-page spread about my return to Cedar Junction and my investment in the community. They interviewed longtime residents who remembered me as a quiet, studious girl who'd left town right after graduation. Mrs. Patterson was quoted extensively, talking about how proud she was of what I'd accomplished and how wonderful it was to see someone give back to their hometown. My parents were not mentioned in the article, though I knew they would read every word. I also made sure that certain other stories became known around town. Stories about how I'd put Harold's children through college, paid for their weddings, helped them start businesses. Stories about the medical bills I'd covered for employees, the Christmas bonuses that had saved families from foreclosure, the quiet acts of generosity that had characterized my adult life. The contrast was impossible to miss. The daughter who gave freely to everyone except the family that had raised her. The successful woman who remembered every kindness she'd received and repaid it tenfold, but who had somehow overlooked her own parents in their time of need. 3 months after my confrontational phone call with my mother, I received word through Mrs. Patterson that my father had died. The experimental surgery had been too expensive, and without it, his heart had simply given out one Tuesday morning while he was sitting in his recliner watching the news. I didn't attend the funeral. Instead, I spent that day at Harold's grave, telling him about the community center, about the scholarships, about the will that would ensure my life's work continued long after I was gone. I told him about the peace I'd found in finally balancing the scales, in showing my family exactly what their love had been worth to me. They wanted me to save them, I said to his headstone, but they never understood that the person they'd created was incapable of saving anyone who hadn't first saved themselves. A week after the funeral, my mother called one last time. Her voice was hollow, defeated, aged beyond her years. "He asked for you at the end," she said. "He said he wanted to apologize, wanted to explain why they did what they did." "And what? Did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him it was too late for explanations." "You were right. Margaret, I know you'll never forgive us. I know you think we got what we deserved. But I need you to know that we did love you. In our own way, we thought we were helping you become strong." "You did help me become strong," I replied. "Strong enough to survive you. Strong enough to build a life that didn't need you. Strong enough to let you face the consequences of your choices without feeling guilty about it." "So this is really how it ends? After everything, this is what our family becomes?" "Mother, this is what our family always was. The only difference is that now you're the one left sitting in the rain." I hung up for the last time and changed my phone number the next day. Whatever happened to Eleanor Westfield after that was no longer my concern. I'd given her the same chance at self-reliance that she'd given me. Whether she succeeded or failed would depend entirely on what she was really made of, just like it had for me all those years ago. The difference was I'd learned that lesson at 14 and had 54 years to build something better. She was learning it at 78, with no time left to recover. 5 years have passed since I changed my phone number and severed the last connection to my birth family. 5 years since my father died calling my name and my mother learned what it meant to sit alone with consequences she couldn't escape. In that time, I've discovered something unexpected. Revenge, when perfectly executed, doesn't feel like victory. it feels like freedom. I'm 73 now, and I wake each morning in the house Harold and I built together, surrounded by photos of Carolyn's children and Michael's grandchildren, my chosen family, the people who know me as Grandma Maggie rather than the abandoned girl from Cedar Junction. They don't know the full story of why I have no contact with my biological relatives. They know only that some family relationships are too broken to repair, and they've never pushed for details I'm not ready to share. Last month, Carolyn brought her youngest daughter, Emma, to stay with me for a week while her parents traveled. Emma is 14, the same age I was when everything changed, and watching her navigate the world with the confidence of a girl who has never doubted that someone will come back for her made me understand how much I'd actually lost and how much I'd managed to rebuild. "Grandma Maggie," she said one evening as we were making dinner together, "why did you decide to build the community center where you did? Mom said it used to be a gas station." I paused in my chopping, considering how much truth a 14-year-old could handle. "Sometimes," I said finally, "we need to replace sad places with happy ones. That spot needed something beautiful to grow there instead." She nodded, satisfied with an answer that was true without being complete. "I think that's really cool. Like, you took something ugly and made it useful." Useful. I'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. I'd taken the worst night of my childhood and transformed it into something that served others. The community center hosts literacy programs for adults, job training workshops for teenagers aging out of foster care, and support groups for families in crisis. It's become exactly what that lonely gas station never was, a place where people help each other, instead of abandoning each other. The irony of my success hasn't escaped me. By teaching me that I couldn't count on anyone, my parents had inadvertently created someone who became incredibly valuable to count on. My business thrived because I understood the importance of reliability. My relationships deepened because I never took loyalty for granted. My wealth grew because I never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what happens to the lessons we learn and the choices we make. My will, the one that excludes my birth family so definitively, has been refined over the years. The bulk of my estate will fund educational scholarships and support services for children from troubled homes. There's a particular focus on helping kids who age out of foster care, who know what it's like to face the world without a safety net. The Margaret Thorne Foundation, established 3 years ago, already operates in 6 states. It provides emergency, financial assistance, educational support, and mentorship programs for young people who've learned, as I did, that they can only count on themselves. Every year on October 15th, the anniversary of my night at the gas station, we announce a new round of scholarships. I always include a note with each award. This is for those who learned early that strength comes from within. Mrs. Patterson died last year at the age of 94. I spoke at her funeral, the first time I'd been in Cedar Junction since the community center opening. She'd been one of the few people who knew the complete story, and she'd spent her final years telling anyone who would listen that families who abandon their children shouldn't be surprised when those children grow up to abandon them back at I. The reception after her service, I overheard conversations that told me everything I needed to know about how my story had become local legend. People spoke in hushed tones about the Westfield girl who'd been left at the gas station and grew up to become the town's most successful entrepreneur. They talked about how she'd helped everyone except her own family, how her parents had died, poor while their daughter owned half the county. Some called it tragic, others called it justice. I called it the natural order of things. I learned that Eleanor Westfield had lived for 2 years after Frank's death, surviving on Social Security, and the occasional charity of neighbors who remembered her from better days. She'd applied for government assistance, food stamps, Medicaid, all the programs she'd once criticized as enabling dependency in others. She'd died alone in the same house where I'd grown up, found 3 days later by a postal worker who'd noticed. Uncollected mail. Neither Thomas nor James had been able to help her significantly. Thomas had lost his job when the manufacturing plant finally closed, and James had filed for bankruptcy after his latest business venture failed. The golden child and the invisible child had both inherited their parents' inability to plan for consequences. I felt nothing when I learned of my mother's death. Not sadness, not relief, not vindication, just the quiet satisfaction of a mathematical equation finally balanced. But standing in that community center afterward, watching teenagers work on college applications with volunteer tutors, I felt something else entirely. I felt the weight of purpose, the knowledge that something good had grown from something terrible. These kids, many of them from situations similar to my own, would leave town with scholarships and support systems and the unshakable knowledge that someone believed in their potential. They would carry forward the lesson I'd learned in a different way, that strength comes from surviving abandonment, but wisdom comes from choosing never to abandon others. The girl who was left in the rain at 14 had grown into a woman who made sure no one else had to sit alone in the storm. That transformation, more than any business success or accumulated wealth, was the real victory. I still live alone, but I'm not lonely. My phone rings with calls from Carolyn and Michael, from scholarship recipients updating me on their progress, from community center staff coordinating new programs. I'm needed in ways that feel chosen rather than obligated, valued in ways that don't depend on blood relation or guilt. Sometimes, when the October rains come, I drive past the community center and sit in my car, watching people come and go from the warm, well-lit building that stands where I once waited in the dark. I think about the scared 14-year-old girl who had no idea she was about to begin building an empire of kindness on the foundation of her parents' cruelty. She would be amazed to see what she became. She would be proud of what she built. And she would understand, finally, that the best revenge isn't making people suffer. It's making them irrelevant while you flourish. That's the lesson I learned from being left in the rain. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let broken people break you. Last week, something happened that I never expected. Something that forced me to confront the one piece of my story I thought was finished forever. Was reviewing applications for this year's scholarship recipients when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before. Uncertainty mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Mrs. Thorne," she said, holding a manila envelope like it might contain something dangerous. "This came by special delivery. The return address says it's from a law firm in Cedar Junction." My first thought was that someone was contesting my father's estate, though there had been nothing to contest. My second thought was that my mother had somehow arranged one final manipulation from beyond the grave. But when I opened the envelope, I found something entirely different. A letter from a young woman named Sarah Chen, along with copies of documents I'd never seen before. Sarah identified herself as a paralegal at Morrison & Associates, Rebecca's firm, and the daughter of Deputy Matthews, the sheriff's deputy who had found me at the gas station 59 years ago. Her mother had recently passed away, and while going through her personal effects, Sarah had found a box labeled with my name and the date, October 15, 1970. Inside that box were photocopies of police reports, social services evaluations, and handwritten notes that painted a picture I'd never seen. The official report I'd always known about was there, but so were others. Follow-up investigations, interviews with neighbors, a psychological evaluation of my parents that had been ordered but never acted upon. Deputy Matthews hadn't simply filed a report and moved on, as I'd always believed. She'd been deeply disturbed by what she'd seen that night, and she'd spent months building a case for neglect and endangerment. According to her notes, she'd interviewed my teachers, who reported that I'd begun showing signs of anxiety and withdrawal weeks before the gas station incident. She'd spoken with neighbors who described my parents as overly strict and cold toward the girl. Most shocking of all was a letter my mother had written to the Social Services Department 3 weeks after the gas station incident. In it, she complained that the police investigation was harassment and threatened to sue the county if they continued to interfere with parental discipline. She accused Deputy Matthews of overstepping her authority and demanded that all records of the incident be sealed. The letter worked. The case was quietly closed, the files buried in bureaucratic storage, and Deputy Matthews was reassigned to a different district within the month. According to her personal notes, she'd been told by her supervisor that pursuing the Westfield matter further would be detrimental to her career advancement. But Deputy Matthews had kept copies of everything. She'd documented every roadblock, every political pressure, every attempt to sweep my case under the rug. She'd written detailed observations about my demeanor during our brief interaction, noting that I'd displayed unusual composure for a child in crisis and signs of learned helplessness consistent with chronic emotional neglect. Sarah's letter explained that her mother had carried guilt about my case for decades. She'd tried to follow up on my welfare informally, but had been warned off repeatedly. She'd watched from a distance as I graduated high school and left town, and she'd followed my career with the pride of someone who'd always believed I would survive and thrive despite my circumstances. When Deputy Matthews learned about my success in business, about the community center, about the foundation, she'd told her daughter that seeing me build something beautiful from something terrible had been one of the few things that gave her peace about the cases she'd been forced to abandon. Over the years, "My mother wanted you to know," Sarah wrote, "that there was at least one adult who saw what was happening to you and tried to help. She wanted you to know that what your parents did was wrong, officially and legally wrong, and that the system failed you, not the other way around." The documents painted a clearer picture of my parents' manipulation than I'd ever had. They hadn't just abandoned me that night. They'd systematically undermined every attempt to hold them accountable for it. They'd used their knowledge of small-town politics and their reputation as good church-going people to silence the one person who'd tried to protect me. Reading those files at 73 was like solving a puzzle I'd been carrying incomplete for 59 years. It explained why no social worker had ever followed up, why the incident had seemed to disappear from official memory, why I'd been left to navigate the aftermath entirely alone, but it also revealed something else. I hadn't been as alone as I'd thought. Deputy Matthews had seen me, really seen me, in a way my own parents never had. She'd recognized my situation for what it was and had tried to intervene, even when it cost her professionally. That night, I called Rebecca Morrison and told her about the documents. She was as stunned as I was, both by their contents and by their implications. "Margaret," she said after I'd read her excerpts from Deputy Matthews's notes, "you should know that this changes things. The statute of limitations has long passed. But these documents prove systematic abuse and cover-up. If you wanted to make this public, to expose what really happened." "No," I said immediately. "That's not what this is about." Instead, I knew exactly what I needed to do with this information. The next morning, I drove to the cemetery where Deputy Matthews was buried. Her grave was simple, marked only with her name and years of service. I stood there for a long time, reading the personal notes she'd written about a scared 14-year-old girl she'd tried to save. Then I called Sarah Chen and made an offer. I wanted to establish a fund in her mother's name, the Deputy Linda Matthews Justice Fund, specifically to support law enforcement officers who advocate for children in difficult situations, even when it's politically unpopular or professionally risky. "Your mother saw a child in danger and tried to help, even when the system worked against her," I told Sarah. "I want to make sure other officers like her have the resources and support to keep fighting for kids who can't fight for themselves." The fund launched a month later with an initial endowment of $2 million. The first recipients were officers who'd gone above and beyond to protect children from family abuse, who'd pushed for investigations when supervisors preferred to look the other way, who'd chosen justice over career advancement. At the awards ceremony, I spoke about Deputy Matthews, the woman who'd seen a child sitting in the rain and recognized that something was deeply wrong with that picture. I talked about the importance of having adults who are willing to stand up for children, even when those children's own parents won't. I didn't mention my own story specifically, but I didn't need to. The message was clear. Some adults fail the children in their care, but others step up to fill that void. The ones who step up deserve recognition, support, and protection from the systems that might otherwise silence them. As I left the ceremony, I realized that this final piece of my story wasn't about revenge or justice or even closure. It was about completing a circle of protection that had begun with one deputy's decision to document what she'd witnessed, even when she knew it would cost her. Deputy Matthews had tried to save the 14-year-old me. Now, 60 years later, the woman I'd become was saving other children by ensuring that future Deputy Matthews would have the support they needed to keep fighting. The girl who'd learned she could only count on herself had grown into a woman who made sure other children would have more people they could count on. That, I realized, was what healing actually looked like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.